Hello and welcome to The Week That Really Was with John McGurk and Sarah Ryan for this week ending the 9th of May 2025 and Habemus Papam. I've just always wanted to say that, Sarah. I've always wanted to say, like, in a kind of, newsreadery context, Habemus Papam. What do you make of Pope Leo the 14th?
What a nerd. It's a wonder you ever got a girl. Seriously.
More than one. No, I won't say that. Sorry. Not concurrent.
Well, I was just speaking about your beautiful wife. I wasn't thinking about I don't know anything about all the ones that came before that. Anyway, what do I think? I don't know much about it. It's because we record this on a Thursday evening. It's fairly new, fresh news. So why don't you tell me more about who this man is?
Well, by now, if you're listening to this on Friday and you don't know that by this stage that it is American Augustinian Cardinal Robert Francis Prevost, then you've been living under a rock. I know next to nothing about Robert Cardinal Prevost, the new Pope Leo the 14th, except to say that he seems very chatty. He came out onto the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica and he talked for a good 15 minutes. I was disappointed he didn't say anything in English because I think actually the fact that there is somebody who speaks English as one of his first two languages, the other being Spanish. I actually think it's funny. He's an Italian-American who spent a lot of time in Peru. He speaks English and Spanish are his two first languages, but he's also fluent in Italian. I thought it was disappointing that he didn't say a few words in English because I think one of the big advantages of having a pope from the English-speaking world is that, the church finally has a leader who can communicate in what is effectively, whether we like it or not, the global lingua franca. English is a language that's taught in almost every country in the world. Billions of people speak it as a first or second language. I think it's a real positive thing that you've a pope who speaks that language. I think a lot of people are obviously, because of the way the church is covered in the media, interested in the specifics of his views on gay marriage or women priests or all that sort of stuff. From what I can divine from my very little reading is that he takes broadly a traditional Catholic view on those matters, but is probably a little bit of a left winger when it comes to matters of economy and war and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, I thought if you look for visual signs, he obviously came out dressed more like Pope Benedict than Pope Francis with the robes and so on. But I mean, we will wait and see. He's going to be around with us quite a while though. He's 69, which is, old for a kind of like normal job, but young for being a pope. So if his normal life expectancy runs out, I mean, we're going to have this guy for the guts of another 20 years. So we'll see. It's far too early to judge him, is my take.
Well, this is a day in history, exciting for a lot of people. I don't know anything about him, but you said he's American or half American.
Did
he grow up in America?
He's from Chicago. Yeah, he graduated from Villanova University in Chicago. Or actually, I don't know if Villanova University is in Chicago. Some American can educate me on that. But he's from Chicago. He was educated at Villanova University. He is, by all accounts, a Chicago Bulls basketball fan. So, he's very American.
Well, that's interesting. That's the first time there's ever been an American pope, I presume, yeah?
Yes, it is the first time in the history of the world there's ever been an American pope. So, we'll see. That's funny. Somebody on NBC said, and finally, after 2,000 years, there's an... Sorry, my terrible American accent. Finally, after 2,000 years, there's an American pope. You're like, well, yeah, America's only 200 years old, buddy. So... Don't jump the gun on that. So we will wait and see on the new Pope, except to say I do think there's something very moving about the sight of white smoke billowing from a chimney and people crying watching it. I think there's beauty in old things and old ways of doing things that is kind of underappreciated. I think conclaves kind of capture people's attention regardless of who's elected because of that. Look, we're not going to spend the whole episode talking about the Pope because we don't know much about him. There's lots of other things to talk about. We're going to talk about my colleague Ben and his run-in with Ruth Coppinger and Paul Murphy. We're going to talk about Skort Gate. If you haven't been following Skort Gate, you just haven't been paying attention to the Irish news. We're going to talk about RTE's decision to get involved in the politics of the Eurovision Song Contest, lobbying for a political outcome there. And we might talk about one or two other things as well. But first of all, Sarah, we've been talking about the Pope. I haven't even asked you how you are.
I'm fine. And your little conversation there, our conversation about the Pope there and geography just reminds me of a correction I must make from last week because I got rinsed in the comments for making a mistake about geography. So in my defence about Cong being in Mayo versus Clonbur, or versus Galway, I should say. My family, parts of my family are from a town called Clonbur, which is in Galway, but right next to Cong. And I
Mm-hmm.
have spent a lot of time over my childhood and adult years in Clonbur and Galway, and we have come and gone from Cong. And I did not realise that I was crossing into Mayo, but that is why I was so sure that it was in Galway. And I'm so sorry to all of the listeners from Mayo who are very upset with me. I'm sorry for correcting you when you said you thought it was in Mayo with the confidence of a middle-aged white man. I was wrong. Sorry. Cong
Well,
is very much in Mayo.
I don't know if listeners will recall, but there was one middle-aged white man who desperately tried to correct you, desperately tried to tell you were wrong. Would you listen? No. I mean, it's just terrible. It's terrible. I mean, honestly, it's women these days. They just can't
The
take
comments
correction.
weren't even half as brutal as, family members rinsing me about how I've been crossing the border into Mayo half of my life and not realise.
Well, look, Mayo people can take comfort because they may not get Sam, but they can keep Cong. Sarah's attempts to conquer it for Galway has been decisively rebuffed. Look, I suppose I've been saying all week, well, not in public, but privately, I don't really want to talk about this whole business of Ben and Ruth Coppinger and Paul Murphy, but everyone else seems to be talking about it, so we better start with it. And I'm just going to ask you for your views. Bearing in mind, this is a Gript podcast. We are obviously talking about something that involves the organization that Sarah and I both work for. I'm the editor. Sarah's just a humble grunt, but we both work for it. Therefore bear that in mind. But it's obviously captured the public imagination. There's been on a lot of radio programs. There's been discussion about Ruth Coppinger's refusal to talk to us on the grounds that we are transphobic, homophobic, biphobic, xenophobic, didactophobic, who knows what it is phobic. And in fairness, the actions of Jack Horgan-Jones from the Irish Times and the girl from the Mirror, Louise Byrne from the Mirror, who, I'm so sorry, Louise, for a moment, I know your name, just went out of my head for a second. Louise Byrne from the Mirror in refusing to continue that press conference have obviously generated a lot of commentary. What did you make of it from your perch down the law library watching the news unfold?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think yes, we are obviously biased, but at the same time, I think that the reason why this captured the imagination of people so much is because it's really part of a bigger picture and an emerging picture, I suppose, worldwide about how journalists can be denied or ignored by certain politicians if it so suits. And I think that ultimately Ruth Coppinger, for people who might have missed this, Ruth Coppinger is on the plinth. She's answering questions, and then Ben asked her a question, and she said, "I'm not answering questions from Gript," and attempts to go to the next person. And then she's challenged by the other journalists, and ultimately the other journalists say, we're going to put a pin in our questions too if you're not going to take questions from the media. And I think, yes, we are from Gript ourselves, but at the same time, we're all, as citizens of Ireland, entitled to have conversations about our elected representatives who are paid by taxpayers' money and the treatment of the media. And the reason why this has captured people's imagination is because the contempt that she shows and the way in which she does it is unbelievably arrogant and, but so kind of obvious and outright that even other journalists stood up to challenge her on it. And I was really proud of those other journalists. I thought they did the right thing in the moment. And long may it continue. I mean, people don't have to like what newspapers or websites or news sites are saying or their particular slant on things. But people need to be adult about their right to exist. And Ruth Coppinger is obviously a shallow, small-minded, ignorant, rude person who is taking a salary to pick and choose who she'll take questions from. And I think the fact that she was called out on it and challenged on it, and she really, ultimately, the great thing about this is that she made a show of herself and she made a fool of herself. And then she doubled down on Twitter. And the response, I think, from her point of view, the negativity of the response to what she did has been absolutely overwhelming. And she deserves that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, but I also, am I just such a ridiculous contrarian that I'll even side against my own platform sometimes in these fights? Look, I think that it would be better if politicians answered questions from journalists when they're put. But that's not why we ask them. Sometimes the refusal of a politician to answer a question tells you more about that politician than actually answering the question does. And my view on this is, I don't think Gript is... I obviously think Gript as an institution is important. I think we do good work, otherwise I wouldn't be doing this job. But I don't think we are the story. What we do here is we try to put questions on behalf of our viewers and our readers and people who engage with our content. Ben is not there to represent Gript when he's holding that microphone. He's employed by Gript to be there. But he's actually there to represent the people who get their news from us. And when he's asking Ruth Coppinger a question, he's not asking a question written by John McGurk on behalf of Gript to pursue an agenda. He's asking a question that voters in her constituency and in Paul Murphy's constituency who get their news from us and relate to the worldview that our outlet advocates and represents, he's asking a question on their behalf. And when she refuses to answer to us, it's not that she's rejecting a news outlet. It's that she's rejecting the opportunity to speak to the people who consume our content, people like who are listening to this podcast or watching it on YouTube. It's you that she's refusing to speak to. And I'm not trying to do that as some kind of political trick. It's just a fact. If we have no viewers or no listeners, we're completely irrelevant. There will be no basis for us to be even there.
But also, John, this is the thing as well, is that and I know, and people who are listening to this right now, and we would never name people because that's not fair. But and I know that on paper, and you just said it yourself there. Yes, maybe a huge element of Gript's listenership and readership is people who feel disenfranchised, left behind by the government or whatever. But it's also a huge amount of people who don't feel that way, but who just are interested in alternative takes. Maybe they don't agree with some. And when this story has gone on this week, there have been mainstream popular journalists and people coming out saying they don't agree with everything that Gript says, but they read a bit of this and they read a bit of that. And and I know that politicians and senior people and people who would never acknowledge Gript in public read Gript all the time, listen to this podcast all the time or whatever. So it is a mainstream thing. It's not just for the disenfranchised, it's for everyone. And the mask slipped there because she has contempt for lots of people, not just people who she thinks are like, that's just an old trope. Like, it's a great yarn. Oh yeah, Grit's homophobic and xenophobic or whatever. Yeah. Like, sure, Jan. But at the end of the day, Gript has tens and tens of thousands of reads every single day. And she just gave them two fingers because apparently she's so morally superior to everyone else that she doesn't have to answer to people that she doesn't like or agree with. And hasn't that been the way of people like her for a long time now?
Well, of course, the interesting thing for me, I think you're right, but the interesting thing for me about this mindset is the anger expressed from sort of people who sided with Coppinger and Murphy over this was not really directed at us. I mean, it was about us, but it wasn't directed at us. So I saw, for example, Conor Lally, who's the Irish Times security correspondent, basically sent out a tweet saying, look, publications have different editorial lines. I don't think anyone would mistake Conor Lally for somebody who agrees with me on a lot of issues. I think he's a fine journalist, but I don't think people would make that mistake. And he was basically defending the journalists who stood up for us, essentially.
Of course.
And the anger that was directed at him was all about this question of legitimizing Gript. So it's this idea that there's a sort of a duty in the media club and indeed the political club to make sure that people like us and clearly the voters, citizens, everyone else we represent, don't get a toe in the door. You don't actually get a seat at the table. You don't get to come to our little club if you hold particular views. And the anger was at, the journalists from the other outlets for being seen to defend us and treat us as members of the club. That's what really made people angry. This idea that, that people can, come into the club with views we don't like. And it strikes me that one of the problems we have in this country is, I've been saying for years that kind of the liberal left has kind of this iron grip on the conversation in Ireland. It sets the rules. Even when you're looking at a debate, that debate is inside set frameworks where the people taking part in the debate are basically debating inside the lines in case they step a foot outside the line and get a deluge of people saying, how dare you let that idea in the door? How dare you let another idea in the door? And what we're trying to do basically is widen those white lines. That's all we're trying to do, to let more ideas into the table. And I think that's why people have responded positively to what we've been doing over the last couple of years. I mean, I don't have,
and that's why I do the podcast. That's literally, you put it really well there. That's the essence of the whole thing. Is that I think that the parameters of our conversations were too narrow on loads of key issues, that we can be as a country and in our media before Gript came along, childish and limited in what we'll allow or what we'll accept or what nettles we'll grasp. If they're too hard, we just ignore them. All these things. That's what this is about. It's about broadening the scope of things. I don't agree with everything I thought a month ago. This notion that I don't agree with everything. I mean, there's conservative journalists who write for the Irish Times and the Independent. Do you know what I mean? Like, people that we know, religious conservative people write in those papers. That doesn't mean the whole paper takes a line. Like, this idea that you kind of stonewall people out that aren't part of the magic club because there are conversations that are difficult and we don't want to face them in case people call us names. Well, tough.
I also think, by the way, I always say this to people in general when it comes to people complaining about the media. And I think there are lots of grounds to complain about the Irish media and how it's performed over the last couple of years. But I'm going to just say this. There is nothing wrong with being a liberal or being a newspaper that advances a liberal worldview. And I am an absolutely relentless critic of Fintan O'Toole in the Irish Times. People who've written my Twitter for years know this. They know I gently mock him sometimes. They know that I very rarely agree with his pieces. But they should also know, and I'll say this as a matter of public record, I religiously read Fintan O'Toole's arguments because I know when I read his argument, I'm going to get a very intelligent, well-reasoned version of an argument I disagree with. And that, I think, makes me a better writer. I think he's a better writer than I am as well. I would say that, but I also think he makes me a better writer and better at doing what I do because he advances an argument that forces me to engage with. And I think in general, if there's one piece of advice I would give any kid who's interested in sort of thinking about the world, I would always say, read an argument by a smart person you disagree with every day. And I think that I know, and I don't talk about this because I don't come on here and tell you everyone who's told me they read Gript or read my writing or whatever. But I know that there are smart people who disagree with what I write on a daily basis, who read it anyway, and read our content. And I would like to think that even if they disagree with it, they take some value from it, and that it makes them address an argument in a slightly different way, or makes them reconsider something they're doing or how they're presenting it. And I think that's the purpose of opinion journalism, certainly, but I think journalism in general. So yeah, but you talk about Ruth Coppinger here, who all I'll say about Ruth Coppinger is to accurately describe her worldview. Ruth Coppinger is an avowed Marxist, communist revolutionary who believes that we need to order society along the lines of what essentially the Soviet Union did. She would say, obviously, the Soviet Union didn't get it perfectly right because real communism has never been tried, but that's the closest. That's who she is. She doesn't believe in debate. She doesn't believe in a diversity of ideas. She doesn't particularly believe, I don't think, in a free society, people free to choose to own various things or to buy various products. She's a communist of the old school. She doesn't believe in diversity of thought or diversity of opinion or the right of people to disagree with her views. I would stand over that assertion in any court.
But she's not smart enough and hasn't done enough deep thinking about it to be able to take even slightly robust questioning on her views. And that to me just shows that she's weak as a thinker and is childish. That's about as nice as I can go, to be honest.
I would have thought the membership of the Socialist Party demonstrated that personally, but besides the point. On this question, though, I want to say this in relation to Louise and Jack and what they did. I mean, neither of them, I think, I certainly don't want it to look, for their sake, as if Gript is endorsing them or claiming them. We absolutely are not. I think they are both fine journalists in their own way, but they write for newspapers with opposite perspectives, and I suspect they hold very different perspectives than we do. But I do have to say that I thought that actually makes what they did a greater act of integrity. right? And I
But
criticize
that's what
Irish
it is, because
journalists.
they're not endorsing another paper. They're standing up for what's right.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
that's where the integrity is. Anybody who's watching that isn't taking that, unless they're committed to misunderstanding the situation, isn't taking that as that either of those journalists are endorsing everything that Gript ever wrote. What they're doing is, and she said it herself, I'd like to think somebody would stand up for me if it was the reverse. They're standing up for what's right. Your other journalists in the press pool are your colleagues, and they're entitled to ask questions, and you should stand up for them on that. And you know, I think they both demonstrated strength of character in that situation that I would like to think, more people would have. That's what it's about. It's not about endorsing or agreeing with us or being on a side or whatever. Who cares about any of that? Let's just have some basic standards of decency and polite manners, and show Ruth Coppinger up for what she is, which is rude.
There's one other thing I want to say here, and this will annoy some viewers and listeners. And I never like doing that, but I'm never afraid of doing it either.
Yeah, you do it all the time.
Yeah, because I think it bears repeating that by and large, in my experience, having done this job for 5.5 years, Ruth Coppinger and Paul Murphy's attitude has been the exceptional one. For all that you will look at over the last couple of years, and I think over the last couple of years, Ben Scannell in particular has gone to government press conferences. He's challenged cabinet ministers. He has at times made their lives very difficult. But they have never. I mean, there was one incident where Leo Varadkar walked out of a press conference, right? And I think that was more of a disagreement over, was there any time left, or are we going to take questions from everybody, or whatever. But by and large, every single one of those ministers, even when Ben is asking them about stuff they don't want to talk about, had the decency to stand there and answer the question. And I think that's important.
No, remember we had a calendar of it. I mean, in fairness, they took the questions. We had a calendar of how irritated they were to take the questions.
Yeah, and we sent the calendar to everyone who was in it as well, in a show of good taste, good humor, what was intended to be good humor rather than mocking humor. But in fairness, I mean, for example, Helen McEntee, who Ben has made her life, I think, difficult at a number of press conferences over the years, but she's never sent the heavy gang in to say, don't let them in or don't let them ask a question. And I think it's important to remember that for all our criticisms of Irish politics and politicians, which we will continue to make, by the way, this is not some kind of amnesty. Most politicians have had the good grace to recognize that though they might loathe the perspective from which we come and regard it as just the worst thing in the world, they have an obligation to answer the concerns of the voters that we represent, even if that means just telling those voters that they disagree with them. I think that's worthy of consideration. And it's one of the reasons why, for all that you might loathe the outcomes of liberal democracy, it is better than a country run by people like Ruth Coppinger and Paul Murphy. Anyway, we've talked enough about this, I think, unless you have something else to add, because I really want to move on. You know how I like talking about cultural issues, and I don't think we spent nearly enough time in Ireland this week talking about Skortgate. Can I make a confession, Sarah? This week was the first time I ever heard of a Skort. I didn't know such a thing existed. Can you explain for the male viewers and listeners out there who still don't know what a Skort actually is?
Well, it's half skirt, half short.
But
Skort.
What does that mean? I mean, does that mean it's got like two leg holes? And because I would have thought a skirt, right? There's no separating.
Shorts would have, like, you'd put your legs into them and they would be separated out. Skort would have, like, imagine like a flap of fabric over the front. So it's like shorts and skirt that are attached, kind of. So basically what it is, for the purposes of the conversation that we're having, it means that, you've got shorts on under your skirt so you can't see your pants, basically, if your skirt blows up.
All right. But, okay. So, educated man here who has never worn a skirt and never will, why would you not want to wear a skirt as a woman? Is it particularly uncomfortable? Is it too hot? Is it...
Not a big Skort wearer myself, John.
Okay.
But no, I don't think it. Like, I don't really see how it would make any difference. You should have really informed me with a couple of days' notice of this conversation, and I would have gone out and tried one on for the purpose of research.
Yeah, you could have walked around the law library in your skirts in solidarity with the GAA.
But so a skirt and a shorts combination isn't really going to feel any different as far as I can imagine. But like, it's not really about that though, John, is it? It's always about politics.
Well, is it about as I understand this, right? And look, this is the thing when you do this job, and I don't want to appear unenthusiastic for people who are listening to this who are really engrossed in the old Skorts row, but sometimes I have a confession. I will see a story brewing in the rest of the media for a couple of days, and I will determinedly ignore it. I'll be like, no, I'm ignoring this shit now. I don't care about Skorts. I don't care about skirts. And I've no disrespect to the many, many people who enjoy the sport, but I've never watched Game of Camogie, and I'm not entirely sure I'm going to take it up at age 41.
Me neither. No, and there was what is the name of the lady from the Social Democrats who's a TD for Dublin Rathdown?
Sinead Gibney.
Sinead Gibney. I came up on my feed, Sinead Gibney doing a very earnest walk towards the camera talking about Skorts, and I went, boring. People dying in the world, not getting involved in this. So, I also was quite allergic to this as a topic, because I also just think that, again, I don't want to talk about this every week, but just how you can summon all of the audacity in your body to talk about women being allowed to wear whatever they want in their sports when you are in favour of men being allowed to play against them in those sports. Jesus wept.
But not in those Skorts.
Yeah.
Look, I don't want to be the guy who trivializes every issue, though, because there are people out there who care an awful lot about this. And as far as I can see, what they care about is essentially that the GAA has been mandating that Skorts be worn instead of shorts. And some women want to play in shorts. I guess the only thing I can think of is that it allows a greater range of movement. Maybe if your hips aren't as constricted, the material is lighter, whatever. I can't figure out what it is, but apparently that's the reason. As best I can figure out, that women want to wear shorts, and the GA says no, the uniform is Skorts. And so therefore this weekend's Connacht Camogie final, the two teams have announced essentially that they're going to take it into their own hands to ignore the GAA's uniform requirement and play the match in shorts, for which they are obviously being lauded as feminist heroes of our time. But to be honest with you, I do think, Sarah, it takes two to tango on this one. I mean, I don't see why the GAA care specifically about whether it's shorts or skirts or Skorts. I cannot. I do see the women's point of view on it.
Yeah, I think the GAA should be telling them what they can and can't wear it in the first place. I just think it's funny that the GAA would choose this as the rock to perish on, with all the other women in sports issues that they might grasp.
Yeah, I think the whole, for me though, the whole story, I mean, because the thing that struck me this week was a Sinn Féin TD or senator, member of the Sinn Féin parliamentary party. I can't even remember which one it was, and I'm not bothered to look it up at this point when we're on air. But one of them rocked up to a Dáil press conference this week, wearing shorts as an act of solidarity with the Camogie playing women of Ireland. And I was just thinking, this is the level politics is at, because this is really a row that should be solved without the involvement of politicians, right? We do not elect politicians to decide what GAA players wear on the pitch. That is a matter between the players and the GAA. And with these politicians, I mean, I was just thinking, like, Rosa Parks make way on that bus. The suffragettes.
But also, John, we had weeks and weeks of nonsense about speaking time. The lads are barely in there. And this is what they're like. Well, the issues and the matters that were of concern and importance to their constituents and and the legislative reforms and legislative changes that might be required to make this country work better and more efficiently for its taxpayers. Well, they were all stacking up while they were fighting about speaking rights. This is what you choose to make your focus in the second week, or is it this third week back after not being in there for forever? How long?
Yeah, but it sums up the whole problem, doesn't it? Because, I mean, these people actually don't have anything of interest to say on any major issue. I mean, we haven't talked about the housing czar, I don't think, really. No. And I don't want to get into the whole debate about what he should be paid or who should get the job. I just want to focus on the fact, which I don't think gets enough attention. Fionn Sheehan wrote in the Sunday Independent last Sunday, the immortal sentence, which I'm paraphrasing, but paraphrasing accurately, was that James Brown has been appointed new Minister for Housing, and his big idea, this was Fionn wrote those words, his big idea was to introduce a housing czar, So we live in a democracy where James Brown, who's a Fianna Fáil TD for Wexford, I mean, presumably he's an ambitious man. Like most people who get into politics, you dream of being in the cabinet someday, maybe someday becoming leader, maybe sometime leader of the opposition, maybe then Taoiseach, right? An ambitious man. He's waited a long time to get into cabinet, to finally get the big seat, to be a person of significance in the country. And his first big idea when being put in charge of housing is to transfer responsibility for housing to somebody else and pay them more than he's getting himself. It's bizarre. I mean, this is the level of politician we have. The idea here is we're going to put somebody else in charge of housing. That's my idea as Minister for Housing, is to give the job to somebody else. And this is taken fucking seriously. Like, people sitting around going, yeah, well, I don't know how much we should pay this fella or who should get the job. I mean, reverse it back to the whole idea of putting somebody in charge of housing to run housing when we've got a Minister for Housing paid 250 grand a year to do that.
And we didn't used to have a Minister for Housing. That ministry is, relatively new, like if you're counting years. It's not an old ministry. It's relatively new. So it was created for the person to be the housing czar. And now it's like, but the thing is that I think that part of that is that's an old trope that worked. It worked during COVID for the Minister for Health to just make make whatever his name was the face of the whole COVID thing, because it works. It's a political switcheroo to kind of put the blame on somebody else, give somebody else the job so that you don't get spattered with the shit that will inevitably come with it.
Well, it's the same. It's the HSE, right? What is the purpose of the HSE? The Health Service Executive. Like, and the chairman of the HSE gets paid a load of money, and the chief executive gets paid a load of money. And the job of the HSE, the one and only job the HSE truly has in this country, is to absorb the blame for poor health policy and have the Minister for Health somebody to blame, right? The health minister should be running the health system. I mean, I was extolling the virtues of democracy earlier on in this podcast, about how they come before us and they answer our questions, all the rest of it. But part of the virtues of democracy is accountability, and that if something is going wrong in the country, you should be able to vote out of office the person responsible. But the more of these jobs you set up, housing czar, HSE, the commission demand to regulate the media, the less power the voter has actually over these policy areas. It's all about removing politics from the democratic arena and putting it into the bureaucratic arena, where we all sit around tutting and going, incompetent HSE. Well, sorry. Look, you either get that or you don't, I guess. And I'm not saying that in a mean way about people listening to the podcast, but like, a lot of people in the country just don't seem to get it. They don't. You either get it or you don't. I can't figure it out.
And so now that the housing czar has decided to eliminate or remove himself from the race, what next?
Well, we have to find a new housing czar. Well,
what about the appointment of a committee to find a housing czar, all paid 150 grand each?
A committee.
Yeah.
Committee. Yeah. I mean, it's a real pickle, isn't it? It's a real pickle.
Just people who are willing to be responsible for a portfolio of the country's work are hard to find.
I got in trouble, by the way, over this during the week for stuff I said on Twitter about this. Because the thing that struck me about it is, I mean, obviously, if you've been listening to this podcast, you know that I've just said that I think the idea of a housing czar is ridiculous. But park that for a second. Because the other big objection was that the housing czar was going to get paid 450 grand a year, which people thought was an obscene amount of money.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is also part of the problem. Because if somebody actually could come in and do the job, a capable, highly effective manager who could come in and solve our housing crisis in 3 years and unblock all things that needs to be unblocked and streamline the planning system, and in 3 years we're turning out 60,000 euros a year, then that person is worth a whole lot more money than 450 grand a year. If you put them 45, yeah.
Same with large capital projects in Ireland. Like, we don't seem to have. Every time there's a big, huge problem, we just take somebody that's already managed something else and put them in, and they've usually managed it badly. I don't have a problem with somebody being paid a lot of money to come in and manage effectively the Children's Hospital, for example. Somebody who's got massive experience in that area from another country. Let's say they come from Abu Dhabi, and we bring them here. We pay them a massive amount of money to bring that project and deliver that project on time, on budget, and leave again. Maybe train in a couple of people underneath them before they leave. But people need to understand this. If you paid them $1 million a year in salary, it would still be less than the consequential costs of incompetence and the rolling, continuing nightmare that something like that becomes when you don't have somebody managing it effectively. And this is the same thing. 450 grand for somebody to be a housing czar and manage the housing and fix housing in Ireland isn't steal. If it worked. Now, I appreciate that what people are going to say is that they don't have any anticipation that it will work. So, therefore 450 grand for more of the same and something not working is too much. And I agree with that. But what you're talking about, which I agree with in theory, is that 450 grand for somebody who's going to actually do what it says on the tin and fix something is not a lot of money.
See, I think I'm going to say something a bit controversial here, but I said it on other podcasts that I've been a guest on, but I'm going to say it here on our own podcast, which is that the problem with state salaries is it's the best money you can possibly get as a bang average person, right? 450 grand a year to be housing czar is the best money you can get as a person of bang average to slightly above average ability. But if you actually have significant ability, the ability to really change things, then you can go and become a project manager, transformational project manager for Amazon or Google or one of the big multinational tech firms, and they will pay you 4.5 million quid a year. So if you want really good, like the top people in the world who deliver really big things, like the people, set aside what you personally think of Elon Musk and think of what his team at SpaceX have achieved in creating a project that brought actual private sector space flight and didn't only make it happen, made it commercially viable so that they make money out of launching satellites. People who manage a project like that are paid tens of millions per year. Yet we're having a multi-billion project in terms of a children's hospital, and we think if somebody was paid 300 grand a year to manage it, they'd be getting too much. I mean, the public have to start thinking, like, it's not as if we're all idiots. We don't sit around kind of going, oh, well, I don't buy things from Amazon because their executives get paid too much. No, you buy things from Amazon because they deliver a really effective, I buy it today, it's delivered tomorrow, it works service. That had to be designed by project managers, most of whom make loads and loads and loads of money. But the idea of bringing in an effective project manager who's done that and putting them in charge of something in the private sector here, and then they want, God forbid, they want 4.5 million to do the job on an annual basis with a 15 million euro bonus if they delivered ahead of schedule. No, we couldn't do that. That would be obscene. Well, I'm sorry. That would save you billions if it worked. And if it didn't work, you know what? They don't get the bonus.
No, but that's it. You just work. I mean, private sector does this all the time. You work in bonus structures. You work in no win, no fee. You work in, if it hasn't been delivered by this time, you don't get paid, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you attract people with big money, but you only pay when it works. I mean, these kind of structures, these kind of contracts are possible. They exist in other areas, and we don't. We whinge about, as you say, the 300 grand, but like, we're left wanting when it comes to the quality of the service that's delivered.
Yeah. Speaking of bang average people getting paid really good state salaries, RTE Director General Kevin Backhurst.
Oh my God, burn.
So I thought it was just a good segue. Announced this week the following pressure from the National Union of Journalists in RTE. He is going to be contacting the European Broadcasting Union to discuss whether the Israeli national broadcaster KAN should still be included in this year's Eurovision Song Contest. The Israeli singer, the Israeli entrant to this year's Song Contest is a lady called Yuval Raphael. She's 25 years old. She was attacked on the 7th of October 2003. She survived. She was one of 13 people out of her group of 50 who survived by hiding under the dead bodies of her friends for 7 hours. She's going to be singing in Switzerland, but RTE has decided that they want to have a discussion about removing her from the song contest. Many people want to do that. Many people across the continent of Europe believe that Israel should not be participating in the Eurovision Song Contest for humanitarian reasons. They want a similar standard applied to the standard applied against Russia, and so on. But most of those people are lobby groups, politicians, campaigners. RTE is a national broadcaster which is supposed to report the news, not make the news. So I guess my question to you is, am I wrong to think that like RTE has just dropped all pretense here of even attempting to be an impartial broadcaster on anything if it's intervening in who it thinks should be allowed to sing in a song contest?
Well, I mean, I said this a couple of weeks ago and I'll say it again. John, you old romantic, did you think that RTE still had credibility on anything?
What I think doesn't matter, really. I mean, I have not paid my TV license ever as an adult. I have said this, by the way, in public so many times. I'm here. All I can do, I mean, nearly, if I didn't fear that like Ruth Coppinger would show up with a hatchet, I would post my address on the internet and say, I don't have a TV license at this address. Come and arrest me. But they've never come. They've never come. I mean, they know who I am. I've said probably I don't pay the TV license. I won't pay the TV license. I am not going to fund that crooked, corrupt organization. I'm not going to do it. I will go to jail first. I'll do an Enoch Burke. You can stand outside Mountjoy with your little sign saying "Free John McGurk," alongside the people saying, "Well, Enoch's out now." But yes, just that is my red line. His was transgender pronouns. Mine is paying the TV license. So my views on RTE are somewhat settled. But like, this isn't the point. The point is it is paid 760 million quid by the public to be an impartial broadcaster. And here it is,
I think RTE got, seduced and addicted to political activism about 10 years ago. And I don't think that they've changed that course since. So I don't think they give off the pretense of anything but that most of the time. So why would this be any different?
Well, it's not, but I suppose all we can do is talk about it, right? Because obviously politicians are not going to defund RTE. In the short term, that is not going to happen. RTE is too valuable to them. It is the only...
We need public service broadcasting.
Yeah, we need public service broadcasting, not kind of... Otherwise, people might start getting their news on the internet. They might start listening to kind of like people like you and me, right? That's the great big danger out there, is people might start getting their news and their commentary elsewhere. So we need RTE, because if you're listening to Philip Boucher Hayes or whoever it is, you're getting unbalanced, you're getting balanced, impartial commentary. But if you're listening to me giving you the opposite view, that's biased commentary. So,
but it's also that, like, why it's not about that the state shouldn't fund any broadcasting. It's about the model. Like, why can't News Talk or Virgin Media pitch for public service broadcasting money for their shows? Are they not equally as, it doesn't have to be podcasts like ours. Why can't it just be, it's nonsense. Ciara Kelly is not less worthy of public service money for her opinions and how she presents her interpretation of the news of Ireland than Philip Boucher Hayes.
That is true. But I have to say, I have always taken the view, and this will be the case for so long as I am editor of Gript, which of course, who knows how long that will be, right? But for so long as I am editor, if the government came and offered us a check tomorrow morning, if they said, look, you can have just 1 million out of that 700 and something million quid, which would be transformational for us, right, for a year, in the name of diversity journalism, I would say no. And the reason I would say no, the reason I would say no is because I'm not immune to the lure of money, right? No one is. And the problem is that when you take that money from the state, right, you take your first million quid and you say, okay, I'm going to give Sarah a raise. I'm going to give Ben a raise. I'm going to hire a couple more staff. We're going to upgrade the website. We're going to take out, various new kind of data content management models that will really improve our reach to the readers. We're going to spend that million. We're going to develop the best news app in Ireland and, really try and be cutting edge. And you do that on the understanding that you're getting the money again next year, right? You do that on the understanding that the million quid is coming, that it's reliable funding. And then you see a general election happen and you see the possibility that the government might change. And the current government has been giving you your million quid a year, but maybe there's going to be a Sinn Féin government now, and they don't like Gript very much, do they? They don't like our worldview at all. And they might change that media funding grant. Well, does that change you as a reporter? My view is that it has to. It has to change. If you're reliant on money, if my choice is, maybe I'll just slant this report a little bit, or maybe I'll just pull my punch here in this press conference because I really don't want to have to tell Sarah next year, sorry, you've got to cut your wages by 60% because the government funding is gone. Then I think I'm going to do it because I'm a human being, right? And that's why I think government funding of the media is absolutely corrosive. And that's not to say, we are obviously, one of the biggest challenges I have in this job is that we are reliant on donor funding. And when I say donor funding, I mean subscriber funding, people who subscribe to us, which means that if we've got 500 subscribers saying, unless you take a particular line on this issue, we're going to cancel our subscriptions. That's a pressure too. That's absolutely a pressure. I feel it from subscribers quite regularly. And I refuse to bow to it, because I think you fund us to be an independent media outlet, not your own plaything. If you don't like what we say, go somewhere else. But it does. When you get those emails from time to time, they're not pleasant. Somebody saying, sorry, I don't agree with, for example, I've gotten this quite regularly, Sarah. I don't agree with your stance on Enoch Burke. I think you should be supporting him unconditionally, and I'm cancelling my subscription. Well, that does apply its own pressure, as does state funding, as does advertising. And I think when you're a media organization, you've got to just try and, at least our funding is diverse, right? I can afford to lose 10 subscribers tomorrow. If I lose 10 subscribers tomorrow, that's not the end of the world. But if I lose £1 million in government funding I'm relying on for the last 5 years, that's existential. And therefore, I think our model is superior, even though no model is without its pitfalls.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't think we're going to be being offered any money, so I don't think it's going to be any concern. But at the same time, I think that public service broadcasting as a model in Ireland is completely the wrong way around. And I think RTE for a long time have been carrying on in a way that is unbecoming of a state broadcaster that is supposed to report the news in an unbiased way. And I think what we're talking about here is just another iteration of that, is another example of how they take sides, take a view. And I mean, I'm not surprised. I don't really know what else,
Well, I just think somebody should put it on the record that it's wholly inappropriate. I mean, obviously it goes without saying, I have my own views on the Middle East, you have your own views in the Middle East, people listening to this have their own views in the Middle East, etc. But even Gript, which has, for the record, on the Middle East, I mean, people like Neve and Matt, right, take a very strong pro-Palestinian line on this. I take a much more...
There's a big mix. Yeah,
there's a mix. But let's assume, for example, that those of you who think that John McGurk, the editor, is Gript and his views represent Gript, let's assume that was true in a kind of heavenly universe where it was true. And we were an outwardly pro-Israeli outlet. There's a difference between adopting that stance and actively intervening in political affairs. Actively, it was launching a petition to the European broadcasting authorities to reject RTE's intervention. That's a political act. It's not a media act. You're not reporting on the news there. You're participating in the news. And that's the difference. This is what RTE is doing. It's participating in the news. It is becoming a player. RTE is now actively the people making the news happen and then reporting on their own actions and then saying, oh, but yes, by the way, we're totally neutral on what's happening in the Middle East.
Yeah.
It's a farce. It's a farce. Anyway, you mentioned Ciara Kelly from News Talk a few moments ago, and you had flagged to me before the programme that you read a column of hers this week, which, did it strike a chord with you or did it annoy you? I can't remember which.
No, I really liked it. So she wrote, I have the headline here. So she wrote an article basically, if insulting somebody based on sex, race or sexuality is wrong, then why is the widespread bashing of straight white men still accepted? And I like Ciara Kelly. I like Ciara Kelly's view, slant on things. I think she's very fair. I think she's very good on the radio and I like her writing. But I also just think that I love that she's writing this article because it's a continuation. Not that I'm saying it was me that started. What I'm saying is that it's part of a growing pushback against some of this stuff. Like when we talked about adolescence, like when we talk about men and women's sports. And I'm here for it. I love that she's writing this kind of stuff because she is more mainstream, let's be honest, than we are. But she's starting to really call out a lot of the stuff that people were a little bit more afraid of calling out before. And, I've said on this podcast for years about the bashing of straight white men. And I believe I would have been talking in the context of men who I would have worked with in utilities and who are going out in the storm and getting the electricity turned back on and whatever. And they're just kind of dismissed as irrelevant, has been kind of pawned into members of society by people who are texting on their iPhone and using electricity, and houses that were built by predominantly, in this country anyway, up until recently, white men. And I just love that she's writing that, and fair play to her. And I think I think it's great.
I often say that I don't.
Excited to see it.
I often say that I don't listen to much Irish media, but I do when I'm driving in the morning, which I'm regularly driving in the morning. If I'm going to Dublin, for example, or going to the airport or something. News Talk Breakfast is the one show I listen to. I really like it. I like the dynamic. I always think it's a little bit like you and me. You know, she's the kind of tough talking, common sense person, and he's the kind of slightly wussy, slightly liberal drip. You know, this reminds me of this dynamic.
You never
Uh,
noticed those parallels before. You're right.
um,
Maybe that's why I like her so much.
but look, on this, I think a lot of people are waking up to this business of, you know, white men this, white men that, white men the other, and I think it's increasingly becoming kind of just an excuse for your own unhappiness, if that's not too profound. Like, I think one of the things about progressivism and liberalism as it has evolved over the last century, without getting too academic about it, is that it has always kind of promised this utopia, right? It has always promised the equality of women, then sort of sexual liberation. Now in latter years, kind of a liberation of people who are oppressed. So black people, gay people, now transgender people. And this long march towards a kind of utopian society where everyone lives in happiness and peace and all the rest of it. And the funny thing is that as each of those barriers has been brought down, you know, gay marriage is achieved, women cannot legally be discriminated against in terms of how much they're paid, all these barriers have been brought down. The problem is that the concomitant promised happiness hasn't really arrived, right? It hasn't really, in fact, if anything, it's gone in the opposite direction. We've more miserable young people now than we ever had. We've more loneliness. We've more kind of people who have never actually been richer and more connected, but kind of feel adrift from the world and discontented with it. And so who's left to blame, really? It's like, you know, you've torn down all the white picket fences, and now all you've got is the poor white blokes wandering around looking at where their fences used to be. So it must be their fault. And I think there's a lot of that going on, particularly amongst kind of like the woke, young, disproportionately female left. That's what I think.
Yeah, and I think but I think that there's and not necessarily Ciara Kelly, but just in general, there's the kind of an emerging feeling that maybe women in particular were kind of sold a pup for a while there about what they can and can't have and what's important and what's not. Somebody on Twitter actually tagged me this week in a really, really, really good article. And it was about this exact thing. And it was a woman who was talking about her journey to becoming a wife, basically. It was is the how I became a wife. I was tagged in it, the FP, and it's about a woman who basically, you know, was taught by her mother, a woman needs a fish like a man needs a bicycle, blah 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 blah, or like a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle, and how she got married and she realized that in actual fact, you know, there was gender roles and they weren't that bad, and staying at home wasn't the worst thing you could do, and she kind of enjoyed it. And I'm paraphrasing, but people should look it up, thefp.com. It's a fantastic article, and it's just about it comes back to that thing that there was a lot of kind of, I feel like a lot of anger and like F the patriarchy kind of pumped into women for the last while. And now there's a lot of women in their kind of late 30s who are sort of left, I don't know, wondering what it actually is that makes them happy, and they're a bit unhappy. And it turns out that blaming men and isn't the only way to go about things, and isn't true or helpful, or, you know, and ultimately you're responsible for your own happiness, and your victimhood or your sexuality or whatever is kind of the least interesting thing about you. And the most interesting you can do is build a life for yourself that makes you happy, instead of screaming your lungs out at other people and blaming everybody for, you know, some societal structure that you perceive has been offending you for years that probably doesn't care.
It's also confused. I wrote an article during the week, and I hesitated, Sarah, about whether to write this article, but I got a press release in. Don't get many press releases in from the Labour Party, but I got a press release in from the Labour Party. I think it was on about Tuesday, from one of their senators whose name escapes me, but she used to work for the USI, and she's quite Laura Harman. Senator Laura Harman. And Senator Laura Harman is delighted because after years, and full credit to her, years of lobbying by her, Jim O'Callaghan, the Justice Minister, has agreed to include in the new Criminal Justice Reform Bill a ban on the practice of sex for rent. And sex for rent is exactly what it sounds like. It is where, so this new bill will create two offences. It will be an offence to go on to a website and advertise a room in your house as available for occupancy in return for sexual favours.
Does that happen?
Oh yeah, apparently it's a considerable practice, and generally seems to be, the victims appear to be, according to the research done on this, mainly non-English speaking migrants of
Okay.
either gender, right?
But it's actually
So
just blatantly said on the ad.
apparently, well,
Or,
this is what's criminalizing. I assume it must be happening at least once or twice if they're criminalizing it, right? So they're hardly going to
okay.
criminalize something that doesn't happen, or maybe they are. Who knows? But it also creates a second offense of offering sex for rent, which is not advertising it, but basically saying, "Here's this room. You don't necessarily have to pay me in cash, but I'll take something else instead." Except presumably more specific than that. And so the government is now to criminalize this practice, which I think is really, first of all, I think, bravo. That should be a crime. It should be a crime to coerce somebody or to get
take
them to have
advantage of
sex.
their poverty. Yeah.
Yeah, except, doesn't that also implicitly concede, Sarah, that consent by itself is not enough? Because surely a rational person can, and I think your husband, who has quite a strong libertarian streak on these matters, for argument's sake, Keith would. I don't want to put words in his mouth. And if I get this wrong, he more than free to come on and tell me I got it wrong. But I think he would argue that free people have a right to make rational choices based on rational decisions. So surely you can consent to have sex in return for accommodation. Sure, that is a decision somebody can arrive at. You will say they're coerced, they're under monetary pressure, all the rest of it, but it's still a decision that they theoretically can make without being, on a rational level. I'm under financial pressure. This is one way to alleviate the financial pressure. Therefore, I'm going to do it, even though it makes me feel a bit yucky. That is consent.
What you're describing is prostitution as well. I mean,
yeah,
if what you're saying then is that, but prostitution is illegal.
yeah, but this is my point. Because is consent enough for sex or isn't it? Because we are told endlessly as young men, for example, and I'm no longer a young man, but young men are told, secure consent, make sure she consents. If it happens and it's consenting, that's different. It's consent. You should never violate a woman's consent. And consent is the watchword in all of our sex education and all of our culture. But actually, when it comes to things like sex for rent and prostitution, we recognize something that basically Christian morality has always recognized, which is that consent is not enough, and that actually you've got a responsibility to the other person to make sure that they don't feel coerced, to make sure that they don't feel under pressure, to have a duty of care for people's emotional well-being. And the point I'm coming around to, maybe in a long-winded way, is that what the sexual revolution has done, in my opinion, is that it has removed that sense of responsibility for other people's welfare from many brief romantic relationships and created this massive sense of alienation because, oh, well, I consented and then he woke up and he was gone the next morning, but I consented, so it's all right, even though I feel really hurt. Or indeed vice versa, if you're the bloke and she's walked out, but that's much rarer. And it also creates this kind of anti-patriarchal feeling because men are all bastards, right? And I think society is very, very, very confused on all of this, which is why, in one hand, it's saying, well, consent isn't enough if you're coerced or you're under a little bit of pressure, but consent absolutely is enough if you're on a night out in a nightclub and he says you're good looking and you want to come back and you're not square. As I think there's other forms of coercion that are much more subtle and much more social that society has nothing to say about in these areas. Maybe I've just gotten miles off topic, but does that make any sense?
Yeah, but I'm not 100% sure what you're getting at. But I mean, I think that these are complicated topics.
That's never a good sign.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think the relations between men and women and how and who we have sex with and how often we have, sex or whatever, and people in their 20s and how they form relationships with each other has become more fluid, more complicated, more common, or more of a common occurrence in their lives as it probably would have been years ago. And then there's apps and everything. So I think this whole topic has become more confusing and we are confused by it. But I think where we fall down on it, and this comes back to what we were talking about before, is that we always seem in our conversations to give the benefit of the doubt entirely to women and no benefit of the doubt to the men. There's also women who manipulate men and have sex with men in exchange for things, but that doesn't get acknowledged or talked about. Do you know what I mean? Like, what about the woman who is pressurizing the man to have sex with her for some gain? You know, like that exists as well. Maybe it's well, it's probably less common, but I just think that when we talk about having complicated conversations about consent, the conversation always leans towards boys are bad, girls are innocent, at sea, don't really understand what they're doing. And that's why we need to give boys consent classes. And this comes back to what I've talked about before, which I object to in the strongest terms, which is always that we need to train our boys not to rape people and not to be this and not to be that, and girl power. And I just object to that.
I do too, but I think it's interesting. You raise an interesting point there about the alleged perfidy of some women. I thought it was really interesting in that sex for rent bill that it's obviously a crime to offer rent, to offer to accept sex in lieu of rent. If you're the presumably male landlord and the presumably female tenant, it is a crime for the male landlord to offer to have sex. Presumably, I think some of it is involved homosexual relationships as well, as I understand. But in general terms, it's a crime for the man to offer the woman that she can stay in the house and pay with sex instead of cash. But it's not a crime in the other direction. So it's not a crime for the woman to say, do you not want to take, will you take something other than cash this month? That's not a crime. That's not exploitative. Which it could be if the landlord is lonely.
Of course it could be. Let's say I'm 41, right? Let's say I'm 41 and I'm single and I live in Malahide on my own and I've got a big house and I want to rent out a room, and some nerdy, naive young lad comes down to Dublin and is looking for a room to rent, and I say to him, well, actually, I'll give you the room. You've no money, but why are you laughing?
Keep going. Keep telling the story.
I'll give you the room. I really regret that I started this. I'll give you the room in exchange. You're making a mockery of it because it's ridiculous the other way around, but it's not. It could happen, John. And that young man would be as much a victim. I'm not. Just move on to another topic. I just feel like your laughter is undermining what we're saying. And don't make
that young man will be a victim. We can all agree.
Don't make that clip the clip of the podcast this week, or I will murder someone.
Well, on that note, we are out of time. And that was a fun way to end it. And, I promise I won't make it the clip of the podcast. But if you're an enterprising viewer out there, I can't restrict what you will do. In a serious note, Sarah and I had a lot of fun doing this, as we do every week. I hope you had a lot of fun listening to us. And yeah, it's great to have the little community that has grown up around this podcast. We really value you, and we will be back this time next week with another episode. In the meantime, have a great weekend, and to those of you who celebrate such things, happy New Poke Day. Take care.